There comes a night in every thinking man's life when thought turns against itself, not because it is wrong, but because it is too right, too precise, too polished, too sharp to feel. It was on such a night that Carl Jung sat with his soul, not the soul as a metaphor or a religious abstraction, but a presence, a voice, a mirror that refused to flatter, a guide that didn't soothe but wounded. This voice didn't come from above, but from beneath, from the neglected caverns of his being where cleverness had no currency, and it spoke plainly. "You will never reach me through intellect," it whispered. All his knowledge, all his careful constructions of theory and model, all the meticulous dissections of myth, symbol, and psyche, none of it opened the door. His soul remained on the other side, watching silently until the time was right to speak. And when it did, it spoke with cruelty and clarity. Cleverness couples itself with intention. Simple-mindedness knows no intention. Cleverness conquers the world, but simple-mindedness, the soul. The words struck like scripture, not to inspire, but to dismantle. For a man like Jung, who had made a temple of the mind, this was blasphemy. And yet, it was also salvation. The soul was not asking him to be smarter, to understand more, to connect more ideas. It was asking him to surrender, to become simple, not simplistic. Simple, poor in spirit. So take on the vow of poverty of spirit in order to partake of the soul. He had spent his life rising through the ranks of intellect, mastering Freud's language, challenging the foundations of psychoanalysis, mapping the unconscious with a scholar's compass. But now he stood before something unmappable, something that refused to yield to brilliance. And this was his trial, to let go of the very thing that had brought him here. His cleverness rose up in protest. He mocked himself for even entertaining the soul's logic. "Many will laugh at my foolishness, but no one will laugh more than I laughed at myself." This was not humility. This was humiliation. The soul had no interest in feeding his image. It wasn't interested in his reputation, his theories, or his legacy. It wanted his essence stripped bare. His cleverness, it said, was a wall. His ideas were distractions, and his intelligence was a curse. For intelligence had taught him how to manipulate meaning, how to twist suffering into analysis, how to guard his vulnerability behind concept and form. But the soul wanted something raw, something not built, but broken, something not conquered, but surrendered. So he took the vow. He vowed to become poor in spirit, like the Beatitude. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." But this was not the heaven of religion. It was the kingdom of the inner world, where symbols live and speak, where archetypes move beneath the surface, where the self is not controlled, but confronted. It was not peace he found, but a slow collapse. The mind, so used to mastery, began to fracture under the weight of not knowing. His soul led him not into the light, but into the desert. And the desert did not speak in the language of psychology. It spoke in silence, in absence of control, identity, structure. He felt his mind mocking itself. This, he realized, was the true descent. Not madness, but the relinquishing of control. Not fragmentation, but the death of cleverness. And what came in its place was not understanding, but presence. Not knowledge, but awareness. He had thought the soul would appear as a beautiful light, an elevated state, but instead, it appeared as humiliation, as contradiction, as the bitter taste of one's own false wisdom. And that was the point. He had to become nothing in order to hear it. There was no applause for this descent, no reward for abandoning the throne of intellect. The soul did not congratulate him for his courage. It simply watched, like a parent waiting for a child to stop pretending. And when he stopped, when the performance collapsed, when the mask of the scholar fell off and shattered into quiet, the soul said only this: "You must return to the state of a fool. That is where I dwell." This was not metaphor. This was not poetry. This was a psychological law. To approach the soul with the sophistication of a surgeon was to find only emptiness. The scalpel of intellect, so precise, so admired, could not touch what was not flesh. The soul was not a puzzle to be solved, but a presence to be endured. And this presence had a demand: stop trying to be somebody. The man Jung had built, the doctor, the professor, the pioneer, that man had to die, not physically, but symbolically. The one who always had a reason, an interpretation, a framework. He had to fall silent, because the soul did not want cleverness. It wanted honesty, brutal, childlike, directionless honesty. It wanted the awkward silence between thoughts. It wanted the stare that didn't know what it was looking for. It wanted the trembling admission, "I don't know what any of this means." Only then did the voice return. It was no longer whispering from the void. It was in him, and it said, "This is the beginning." Jung had always believed that understanding was the goal. Now he realized understanding is a seduction, a way of staying safe, a way of holding the world at arm's length. But the soul doesn't want to be understood. It wants to be felt, lived, entered, suffered. This is the wound of the wise, the unbearable tension between knowing and being, between having the map and actually walking into the unknown. And this tension cannot be resolved by thinking more. It must be resolved by letting thought go, like a raft once you've reached the other shore. But Jung hadn't reached any shore. He was lost in water. The soul had not offered land, only immersion. And so he drifted, naked of thought, unclothed by ideology, abandoned by certainty. For the first time, he saw himself not as a thinker, but as a man, raw, confused, longing. And in this rawness, he met something holy. Not the holiness of dogma, but the holiness of vulnerability, of becoming inwardly poor. The vow he took, the vow of spiritual poverty, was not a retreat from knowledge. It was a betrayal of pride, a betrayal of the voice inside that says, "You should already know." He didn't know. And in that, he began to see. He began to see the quiet intelligence of dreams, the strange order of chaos, the value of contradictions that never resolve. He began to feel the soul not as a teacher, but as a companion, one that had always been waiting behind the noise. And what was that noise? It was the voice of cleverness, the one that never stops analyzing, never stops measuring, never stops trying to win, the one that turns every question into a thesis, every feeling into a concept, the one that Jung, for so long, had mistaken for himself. It was not himself. That voice was the mask. The soul was the silence beneath it. And so he began to laugh. Not the laughter of joy, but of release. The strange, unhinged laughter of someone who sees how ridiculous they've been, who sees the years wasted performing for an inner judge that never existed, who realizes that everything he had used to build his life had also built his cage. The soul, watching him, did not laugh. It simply nodded, as if to say, "Now you're ready." But ready for what? Jung didn't know, and that was the point. He began to sense that the soul had always been there, not silent, but ignored. Its voice had not been absent, it had simply been drowned beneath the roar of interpretation. Interpretation, that addictive drug of the intellect, which gives the illusion of control over mystery. But the soul is not a riddle to be solved. It is a presence to be endured. It does not answer. It waits. It waits until you are empty enough to listen, until your theories collapse under their own weight, until the scaffolding of self-importance crumbles, and all that remains is a trembling human being who can no longer pretend to know what life is. This was where Jung found himself. He no longer sought explanations. He sought only the truth behind the silence. He no longer asked why, but simply said, "I'm here." And it was there, in that raw admission, that the true work began. Not the work of the psychologist, the work of the soul. This work cannot be written in books. It cannot be taught. It cannot be passed down in academic language. It begins when a person realizes that they have lived inside a structure built by fear. The fear of not knowing, the fear of being seen as foolish, the fear of becoming small. But to the soul, smallness is sacred. Simple-mindedness is the favored place of the soul. Not because it is unintelligent, but because it is unburdened. The simple mind does not seek to dominate. It does not armor itself with definitions. It does not flinch at paradox. It allows the world to be as it is. Terrifying, beautiful, ungraspable. And in that openness, it becomes wise. Not wise in the way clever people admire, wise in the way children see, in the way dreams teach, in the way suffering strips you of everything you thought you needed, until only your breath remains, and you realize that is enough. Jung had spent his life collecting knowledge. Now, in the dark night of his own psyche, he began the sacred process of forgetting. Forgetting not as failure, but as liberation. Forgetting all the ways he had tried to outsmart pain, outmaneuver confusion, outthink the abyss. The abyss did not care how clever he was. It only asked one question. Will you let go? Let go of the man you built. Let go of the voice that always has an answer. Let go of the fear that without your intelligence you are nothing. Let go of the belief that salvation is something you can earn with effort. It isn't. It comes in surrender. And in that surrender, the soul begins to rise, not in fire, not in triumph, but in stillness, in quiet attention, in a kind of sacred indifference to all the games the ego loves to play. The soul doesn't need you to be brilliant. It needs you to be real. It needs you to be torn open, humbled, emptied of the need to impress, so that something deeper can emerge. In this state, Jung began to feel again, not just analyze his feelings, but feel. He wept, not for others, but for himself, for the child he had abandoned in favor of the academic, for the inner fool he had mocked, for the years spent chasing shadows instead of sitting in the dark with them. He began to reclaim the pieces he had cast aside, the irrational, the emotional, the vulnerable. He no longer saw them as weaknesses. He saw them as doorways, the very gateways his cleverness had taught him to avoid. And through those doorways, the soul moved. It moved in symbols, in dreams, in irrational images that made no sense but carried the weight of truth. And Jung stopped trying to translate them. He let them speak in their own language, a language older than thought, the language of the psyche itself. He no longer needed to win the argument with his unconscious. He just needed to listen. In the absence of understanding, something strange happened. Jung began to feel alive again. Not the life of accomplishment, applause, or validation, but the kind of aliveness that cannot be seen from the outside, the aliveness of the inner world rekindling itself, like forgotten embers hidden beneath the ash, waiting for the right breath to awaken them. And the soul was that breath. It did not speak in commands or logic. It revealed itself through moods, through color, through the way the wind moved through a tree outside his window. Everything became symbolic, not as metaphor, but as presence, a living texture of meaning. The boundary between the inner and the outer collapsed, and he understood. The psyche is not locked inside the brain. It is the world. It is the world as it appears to a soul no longer defended by cleverness. This revelation was not gentle. It was disorienting. The man who once dissected symbols for clinical insight now stood inside them. He was no longer the observer. He was the dream itself. And in that dream, the soul led him deeper, deeper into the figures that rose up unbidden in his visions. The prophet, the blind seer, the serpent, the woman with burning eyes. Archetypes, yes, but no longer categories to be filed away. They were living presences, as real as memory, as confrontational as truth, each one a mirror, each one a wound. And still, the soul said, "Do not interpret. Stay with them." That was the hardest part, to stay, not to escape into clever explanations, not to reduce them into language, but to let them work on him, to allow their images to reshape his psyche. He began to feel less like a man and more like a clay vessel, undone, remolded, broken again, reshaped. This was not therapy. This was initiation. The soul was not interested in healing his wounds. It was interested in opening them wider, until they became portals, until the pain was not a problem, but a path that led down, not up, down into the dirt, the grief, the disowned madness he had tried for years to make palatable through terms like complex, projection, shadow. These weren't theories anymore. They were forces. He could feel them moving inside him, unspoken, ancient, brutal in their honesty. And his cleverness, it trembled before them. It offered its usual tricks, insight, diagnosis, explanation. But the soul saw through all of it. The soul said, "You are still trying to protect yourself." It was true. Even in this sacred descent, some part of him still wanted to be in control, to master the unknown rather than be mastered by it. But the soul does not compromise. It demands full surrender, even of the part that surrenders strategically, hoping for transformation in return. There is no transaction here, no cause and effect. The soul does not operate on reward, it operates on reality. And the reality was, Jung had to die. Not literally, symbolically, mythically. He had to die to the man he thought he was, die to the expert, die to the superior knower of things, die to the illusion that if he just thought hard enough, he could stay safe from the deeper truths that exist beneath every life. He didn't know how to do this, but he no longer resisted. He let the fire come, and in that fire, something holy happened. His soul laughed. Not a cruel laugh, not a mocking laugh, a cosmic laugh, the kind of laugh that arises when all illusions collapse and nothing remains but the absurd, raw beauty of being human, the kind of laugh that can only be heard at the end of pride, when there's no more image to uphold, no more self to defend. Jung laughed too, not because anything was funny, but because for the first time, he was free. He was free, not in the way the world understands it, with choices and achievements and autonomy, but free in the deeper, more terrifying sense, free from the illusion of who he thought he was. That illusion had been built slowly, layer by layer, through praise and performance, study and success, but it was always fragile, held together by the belief that cleverness could save him, that by naming his pain he could master it, that by analyzing the soul he could possess it. But the soul cannot be possessed. It is not a subject. It is not even a thing. It is a living presence, a source, a mirror that shows you everything you don't want to see, not to shame you, but to strip you bare, to bring you home. And now, Jung saw what home actually meant. It was not a place. It was a state of being, one where cleverness was no longer necessary, one where the mind, humbled, no longer needed to prove its worth, one where the question was not, "What do I know?" but, "Who am I without knowing?" That question echoed through him like a bell. Who am I without knowing? Without the books, the titles, the diagrams, the lectures, the interpretations? Who am I when the scaffolding collapses and I am left with nothing but breath and bones and trembling awareness? He didn't answer the question. He couldn't. That was the lesson. Some truths are not meant to be answered, they are meant to be lived. And so he lived the question. He walked with it. He let it hollow him out. He let it unravel the parts of him that still sought control. He let it make him foolish, not in the eyes of others, but in his own. That was the hardest humiliation, to see the limits of his intelligence and still continue without it as his shield. Because only then, when the shield is dropped, can the soul begin its real work. It does not teach, it transforms, it burns away everything false. It dismantles the identity that was built to be admired. It reduces the ego not to ashes, but to something softer, something human. It does not leave you enlightened, it leaves you honest. And honesty, Jung realized, was the most terrifying state of all. Not because it is painful, but because it is vulnerable. It exposes you to yourself. It removes the mask, not just in front of others, but in front of your own gaze. And in that exposure, you begin to see the person you abandoned long ago. The one you were before you learned how to be clever. The one who cried without reason. The one who danced with dreams. The one who saw gods in the trees and heard voices in the silence. That child was still there, not waiting to be remembered, but waiting to be received. And the only way to receive him was to forget everything else, everything you were told you had to become. The soul wasn't asking Jung to grow. It was asking him to return. To return to what? To simplicity, to stillness, to the terrifying beauty of not knowing. And in that state, for the first time in his life, Carl Jung no longer needed to be Carl Jung. He could just be, and the soul, his soul, finally stopped watching from a distance. It sat beside him. It didn't speak. It didn't offer revelations. It simply stayed, present, still, real. And in that stillness, he wept again. Not from sorrow, not from fear, but from a sense of reunion, a sense that after all the striving, all the wandering, all the brilliance and breakdowns, he had come home. Not to a better version of himself, but to the one he had buried, the one who never needed to be clever in the first place. And so, under the weight of stars and the silence of a mind finally emptied, he let the last piece fall. No more defenses, no more arguments, just the raw pulse of being. This was the night Carl Jung realized his intelligence was a curse, not because it failed him, but because it had succeeded too well. It had kept him safe, but also alone. And now, without it, he was finally open enough to feel the soul, not as an idea, but as a presence, a stillness, a return, and in that return, nothing needed to be explained. Nothing needed to be earned. It was enough to simply sit beside the mystery and not run.